among other things, we live in a global world, etc., and you have all the advantages that I mentioned in terms of civil society involvement and certain rights that you can create. But this honest ability that I mentioned in the local legal reforms, you don't face that in the international arena, among other things, because it's very difficult to change an agreement. It's an agreement between two parties, and you need the agreement of the other side, etc., etc. So whenever there is an opportunity to enter into an agreement, even as I mentioned, agreements related to foreign investments or trade, references can be made to economic development, or provisions can be included in order to promote opportunities, such as the reference I made about procurement, or provisions about respect of labor rights and so on. So there is always an opportunity through international mechanisms to somehow include references to development.
Second row. Go ahead.
أبتدأ من حيث انتهى السيد المحاضر. أقول هل يكفي أن ينخرط بلد في المنظومة الدولية ويصادق على الاتفاقيات حتى يكون هناك حماية لحقوق الإنسان؟ في تونس مثلا وطوال نصف قرن تم انتهاك حقوق الإنسان، وتم انتهاك حرياتهم، وتم انتهاك أعراضهم، بالرغم من أن تونس صادقت على كل الاتفاقيات الدولية التي تحمي تلك الحقوق، وكانت تقدم تقارير للأمم المتحدة، وكان الجميع يعلم أن تلك التقارير ليست لها صلة بالواقع الذي يعيشه تونس. ويعني كان هناك يعني يمكن أن أقول تعمد عدم يعني الاعتراف بتلك الانتهاكات. بالتالي أقول أن مجرد المصادقة على الاتفاقية الدولية لا يكفي، وجوب أن تكون هناك آليات رقابة على الدول التي تصادق على تلك الاتفاقيات باعتبار وأنها ملزمة. أرى أن يعني كنا ننتظر يعني في العديد من البلدان العربية أن مصادقتنا على الاتفاقيات الدولية سوف يكون فاعل لاستشراف أو للنهوض بتلك البلدان، لكن رأينا أن هناك في جانب تواطؤ كبير مع الدكتاتوريات التي خذلت تلك البلدان.
Thank you. Well, let me start where you ended. And I would like to start with a question. The question is being part of the international system of agreements a guarantee for certain laws not to be violated? We know, for example, that when it comes to human rights and human rights protection in Tunisia have been violated for decades. Yet Tunisia was a signatory of the main international agreement regarding the protection of human rights. And I think that Tunisia has raised a number of reports to the United Nations lauding its record in protecting human rights when everybody knew that those reports had nothing to do with the reality. So in my view, what is necessary in addition to signing those agreements is to create a mechanism to ensure the proper implementation, to ensure that each country not just is signing on a piece of paper, but have the actual tools and mechanism for the implementation of these agreements, because they have to be binding, and if they are binding, then they have to be implemented. That's essentially what it is.
Yes, I agree with you that in the arena of international agreements there is a lot to be made. I think the job is not finished. One example that I always mention in conferences is the difference of protection between foreign investors and human rights victims. A foreign investor, as I pointed out in the example of Salini versus the Kingdom of Morocco, a foreign investor with the given agreements in place, eventually, if somehow those agreements are violated, that foreign investor eventually can go to an international arbitration, can obtain an award, and can obtain a satisfaction in a neutral place in the international arena. A person whose human rights have been violated, provided that the agreements are also in place, is in a very weak position when it comes to enforcement of those rights. That person needs to go, in the case of Latin America, that person needs to go to two levels of adjudicatory bodies, and after 10 years, in most cases, of litigation, the person obtains a decision, and even at that point, the decision needs to go to the local courts to be recognized in order to reestablish the human right that has been violated. In the context of, that's so far the only international body that we know in terms of human rights. In Africa, we don't have a court. What we have is a Commission on Human Rights. And then we have, in the context of the United Nations, we have committees which do not issue mandatory decisions. So I totally agree with you that more things need to be undertaken in the field of international agreements. Now, would I say that countries do not need to be bound by international agreements on human rights? I don't think so. I think it's at least better to have something, some kind of international, some kind of agreement whereby some kind of commitment can eventually be implemented, and whereby some kind of decisions can be issued, because it generates international pressure. It generates the involvement of civil society, the media, as we saw in the case of Tunisia that you pointed out. Yes, the country was not complying, etc., but eventually the international community came aware of what was going on, and the whole local dynamic with the combination of the international pressure probably made the whole event develop. One example that I want to reiterate, because I mentioned that in the context of Peru. Peru was an example of a country probably similar to Tunisia. It was violating human rights. Worse, it was not complying with the decisions of the International Court on the Inter-American Court on Human Rights. Because, as I said, the process is kind of strange. It needs to go back to the local court. But that administration eventually was removed, and the subsequent administration realized that they needed to have a monitoring body that would not only follow the provisions of the international agreements, but would also require the local agencies to comply with the decision of the international body. So there you have an example that over years eventually made things happen.
All right, we're out of time. Thank you very much. Lunch will be served downstairs on the first floor in about 5 minutes. So, Congressman Mickey Edwards will be our keynote speaker downstairs.
Gracias.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.